Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario, Canada, and we're looking at the Stratus Vineyards 2020 White Label Cabernet Franc. Established in 2000, Stratus Vineyards ushered in a new era of grape growing and winemaking in the Niagara Peninsula and Ontario, with their strong focus on innovation and sustainability. There are 55 acres, or about 22 hectares, of vineyards are planted with a diverse range of grape varieties, 10 red grapes, 6 white grapes, and these serve as their palette from which they craft their iconic Stratus Red and Stratus White blends, both wines inspired by the European tradition of assemblage. The estate's 100% gravity flow winery was the first winemaking facility in the world to receive LEED certification for environmental sustainability. And their founding winemaker and Loire-native J-L Groux guides Stratus's vision towards uncompromising excellence in the cellar, and he is supported by winemaker Dean Stoyka, who has been with Stratus working in the vineyards and cellars since 2010. Like many wineries in the Niagara region, Cabernet Franc is an important part of Stratus's focus in their vineyards and cellar. And they're farming around 18 acres, that's about 7.64 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines. And from these, they're making their single varietal Cabernet Franc, red and rosé. And this is consistently one of my favorite Cab Franc rosés produced in the region, I might add. And the grape also plays a supporting role in their flagship Stratus Red blend. And today, we're looking at the newest addition to the Stratus family of wines, their White Label Cabernet Franc, a wine that was 20 years in the making. So Stratus and their vineyards are located in the Niagara-on-the-Lake regional appellation, and more precisely, the Niagara Lakeshore sub-appellation. And the Niagara Lakeshore sub-appellation is one of 4 sub-appellations that make up the larger Niagara-on-the-Lake regional appellation, along with 4 Mile Creek, the Niagara River, and St. David's Bench. And this area of Niagara-on-the-Lake is located just east of the city of St. Catharines, and it's a relatively flat swath of land, and it's about 12 kilometers from north to south and about 12 kilometers wide from east to west. And it's bordered to the north by Lake Ontario, to the south by the Niagara Escarpment, and to the east by the Niagara River. And like everywhere across the Niagara Peninsula, Lake Ontario's moderating influence makes viticulture possible here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And in general, across this area during the growing season, as you move south away from the lake, conditions get progressively warmer and the growing season will get a little bit shorter. Now, this area of the Niagara Lakeshore, this is the most northerly of these 4 sub-appellations. It's the closest to Lake Ontario, and it's an area that's about 3 kilometers wide from east to west, and it's actually bordered on 3 sides by bodies of water. We have the Welland Canal to the west, Lake Ontario to the north, and then the Niagara River to the east. And most vineyards are within 2 kilometers or less of Lake Ontario. So these bodies of water have a major influence on the growing environment, both during the summertime as well as the conditions in the wintertime. So this area of the Niagara Lakeshore is a relatively flat, low-lying area with elevations ranging from around 75 to 95 meters above sea level. And the area has this very gentle grade towards the north, towards Lake Ontario. And because of this and its position close to the lake, it receives the strongest influence from Lake Ontario. And during the growing season, this actually makes the daytime temperatures during the summertime a little bit cooler, but conversely, the evening temperatures are a little bit warmer. So we have slightly cooler days compared to other parts of Niagara-on-the-Lake, but warmer nights. And this creates a gentler, more moderate climate. It also extends the ripening period into the evenings. And because of this proximity to the lake, this also extends the growing season into the fall. So while the Niagara Lakeshore region has the fewest number of growing degree days of any of the sub-appellations in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, it actually has the longest growing season with the most frost-free days. So as a whole, this area is one of the best areas in the Niagara Peninsula for ripening longer season red varieties. Now, in terms of soils, across the Niagara Lakeshore area, we have these very deep glacially derived soils, and we will find a mix of textures. We'll find sandy loams, there are silty clays, there are some areas of heavier clay loam till, depending on where you are. And these soils will have varying amounts of stoniness. And these stones are eroded materials from the Niagara escarpment, so limestones, sandstones, and shales. The bedrock here is the Queenston Formation red shale. It's well below the surface, and this is a combination of red and gray calcareous and argillaceous shales that have a high iron oxide content. Now, this white label range from Stratus was launched with the 2020 vintage, and it was created out of a deep understanding of their vineyard parcels with the idea that they wanted to create a very pure expression of these vineyard parcels, these microsites in excellent vintages, a study that really wouldn't have been possible without a lot of time and attention to detail. So with every vintage that they make this white label range, the block destined for the white label range will change, and the fruit selection happens in the vineyard at the time of harvest. So in the case of this Cabernet Franc, of the estate's 15 individual parcels or individual blocks of Cabernet Franc, it was their block 1 that was selected for the 2020 vintage. And this is a 0.5 hectare block of Cabernet Franc that was planted in 2001 and planted with clone 214. And this block is located about 2 kilometers south of Lake Ontario and 2 kilometers west of the Niagara River. So it's in a nice Goldilocks zone in terms of climate. And then in terms of soil, what we have here is a deep silty lacustrine or a deep lacustrine silty clay. And it has actually a high degree of stoniness. Dean said that the soils have quite a lot of stones and rather large rocks throughout. And these are limestone and shale stones, as I said, derived from the Niagara escarpment. So the soil is a little bit more coarsely textured. It has excellent drainage as well. The vineyard is farmed sustainably without the use of herbicides, and they are employing the use of cover crops throughout the vineyard blocks as well. And in terms of viticultural practices, they do employ or they do selective leaf removal. They also do green harvesting, and their desired yield for the Cabernet Franc is around 2.5 tons per acre. Now, in terms of the winemaking for this wine, in keeping with the winery's intention to create the purest possible expression of place for their white label Cabernet Franc, they decided to use a neutral vessel for the fermentation and aging, and in this case, clay amphora. So for the winemaking, the fruit is all hand harvested, it is hand and optically sorted, and the fruit is all destemmed. And then in terms of the fermentation, it is in clay amphora. In fact, 2 clay amphoras in 2020, and one was inoculated with selected yeast. The other was fermented with indigenous yeast. And the target fermentation temperature was around 26 to 28 degrees Celsius. The total time on skins is around 28 days, and they will do like a modified rack and return method to aid a gentle extraction and keep the cap wet. So no punch downs are done on this wine. They really do want to keep the extraction rather gentle. After the post-fermentation maceration, the free-run wine is then drained off the skins, and they are only using the free-run wine in this finished cuvee. And so that free-run wine is then aged again in amphora on the fine lees for about 18 months before the wine is bottled. And the total production or the total volume for this first vintage of their white label Cabernet Franc was around 2,400 bottles, about 194 cases in total. So let's dive in. Oh, I should mention as well, perhaps it goes without saying, but 2020 was an excellent vintage in the Niagara region, particularly for the red Bordeaux varieties. A very warm, very dry vintage, probably one of the best vintages for the red Bordeaux varieties in at least the last decade, perhaps even longer than that. So in terms of the nose, I am getting, a definite kind of a ripeness here. And I would say the fruits, well, first of all, I would say that this leans definitely a little bit more fruity on the nose as opposed to kind of savory or earthy. There's a really nice purity to the nose as well. There's a definite ripeness there, but it's by no means overripe at all. And I love the fragrance. It has a nice mix of red fruits and some darker fruits. There's a little bit of black raspberry, a touch of Bing cherry. There's a little bit of cassis, maybe even a little bit of like a wild blueberry compote thing going on as well. And there is a really lovely underlying herbaceousness or herbal undertone that comes through for me as a bit of bay leaf. There's a touch of marjoram here, maybe even a little bit of rosemary. But I would say the nose leans more fruit forward. There are some herbal layers here. There's also a little bit of pepperiness on the nose, kind of white and black peppercorns. Delicate floral note as well. It's not super floral, but there is this little underlying note of violets. And yeah, the nose is really pretty. There's a nice intensity to the nose. Like you sense there's a lot of depth here and there's a lot of concentration as well, which I think is a hallmark of what Stratus's approach is with respect to their winemaking. So on the palate, this wine has, I would say the fruits are pretty consistent to the nose. Perhaps they lean a little bit more dark, but still in that sweeter, fleshier fruit spectrum. I would say that blueberry and kind of cassis note pop forward a little bit more. There's even a little bit more of like a plumminess on the palate, which is really nice. There's also some additional layers to the herbaceousness on the palate, which I quite like. So those herbal undertones come through, but there's also a little bit more of a foresty edge and getting a little bit of cedar leaves, cedar wood. There's also a lovely cured tobacco note, which for me is one of those markers for Niagara Cabernet Franc, is this wonderful cured tobacco note, which I quite like. The palate is also quite peppery. I noted the pepperiness on the nose, but it is even more kind of spicy and peppery on the palate. Definitely. It's awesome. It creates this wonderful kind of lift on the back end, that white and picked peppercorns, or white and black peppercorns, I should say. And then there's even a little bit of a cinnamon stick thing going on the palate as well. The acidity, as you can probably tell from me speaking, there is some really bright acidity here. So while this was a warmer vintage for the Niagara region, there's some really beautiful acidity here. Cleansing, very refreshing acidity, and it is helping to provide some nice tension and focus to that palate experience. So while the nose leans a little bit more on that riper side, the palate focuses in a really nice way, thanks to those herbal undertones and those additional layers and that spiciness, but also thanks to that nice refreshing acidity. Now, in terms of the tannins are really quite interesting. There's actually a moderate to plus amount of tannin here. And I think that's a part of the, the clay amphora and how that kind of works with creating those tannins. I've tasted Cabernet Franc from amphora from other parts of the world, and there is a distinctive textural sensation that the amphora brings to the tannin profile. When the tannins are fine grained, there is a nice ripeness and roundness to the tannins, and they have almost like a corduroy like texture. There's a kind of a fuzziness to the tannins, which are really nice. The wine overall has this, I would say, medium plus body. This is a richer style of Cabernet Franc, a little bit more voluptuous style of Cabernet Franc, and that is certainly, telling of the vintage. As I mentioned, this was a very warm, dry vintage, so that level of ripeness and kind of opulence would be expected, and is pretty consistent with other examples of a 2020 Cabernet Franc I've had from Niagara. But the wine sits a little bit more broadly. It has a nice roundness to it, and there is this wonderful fleshiness and plushness to this wine that is really quite inviting. Yeah, it's really, really nice. It's a young wine, I should say that as well. There's great concentration here. And the way the tannins and the acidity and the fruit are all working, it's actually quite harmonious. And I would say this wine is showing pretty well in its youth. There is a certain approachability here, but I think it's going to be even better in 3 to 5 years' time. I think with a little bit of time, that's going to help soften those tannins in a nice way. There's enough concentration and acidity to carry this wine for the medium to longer term. And I think this wine is going to get even better in about 5 or so years' time. But it's really delicious. And what I really appreciate about this wine is the fact that there is no oak influence. And when they released this wine, I got very excited. I have a lot of respect for Stratus as a winery and what J-L and Dean have been doing there on the winemaking side of things. And they've long been one of these wineries from Niagara that I consistently recommend to people whenever they're visiting the region. And so I was very curious to see how they would approach Cabernet Franc without the use of any oak. And I think they've done a really nice job. You know, there's terrific purity here, there's great translucency, and you really feel the essence of the grape and the place. And I do feel like it does feel very much like a Niagara Cabernet Franc in that way. And I really, really appreciate that about this wine. And you know, it really, for me, you know, this is a serious wine. It's a contemplative wine. It's a wine destined for the cellar that you can tuck away for a while. And it just proves the fact that we don't necessarily need wood to make a serious style of Cabernet Franc. I think there's a tendency in the New World to just, you know, with every tier of Cabernet Franc, qualitatively speaking, people just kind of add more and more wood. You know, I'm generalizing, of course, but this is just from my experience in tasting, and I don't think it's necessary all the time. I think you can make a beautiful Cabernet Franc without the use of oak, and this is a perfect example of how one can create a beautiful expression of the variety and of the place using a more neutral fermentation vessel. So kudos to J-L and to Dean for experimenting with this style of winemaking, especially in a vintage like 2020, where there was just so much great ripeness of the fruit and just such a great vintage overall. It seems like the perfect vintage to kind of experiment with a technique that is a little bit different and a little bit more atypical, I would say, for the Niagara Peninsula in terms of fermentation and élevage. So this is a really exciting wine, and one that I intend to get a couple more bottles of to tuck away for future aging and to kind of revisit in a few years' time. And if you are in the province of Ontario, this is definitely one to put on your shopping list. It's $65 Canadian, which I think is actually a superb value as far as Canadian Cabernet Franc and Ontario Cabernet Franc is concerned. And if you are outside of Ontario, well, you know, this is one to perhaps look. They do a little bit of export, so keep Stratus on your radar, regardless of its Cabernet Franc or not, because it's an excellent range of wines. White, red. Their Stratus Red is one of my favorite red blends from across the region. So this is a winery to put on your radar, and I'm finally thrilled to be able to kind of tell a little bit of Stratus's story with respect to Cabernet Franc, because as I said, this is a winery that I have a great deal of respect for, and I think they're doing amazing work and flying the Canadian wine flag in a really, really admirable way. So if you've had this wine, I would love to know what you thought of it in the comments below. And of course, as always, I'll be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.